What I hear from my customers on the ground here, but also in Australia, is there's a lot more activity in terms of intra and inter-ASEAN M&A in agribusiness. Can you tell us what you're seeing in that space?
Sure. So I guess let's talk about what's driving that and maybe go back to the growth equation first up, and then we'll talk about the M&A piece or the investment piece. So firstly, there are two things that drive growth, essentially income growth and population growth, and you've got both of those factors in ASEAN and in the Philippines. So you've got some of the fastest growing markets in the world, very young, very dynamic, and entering into what we call the demographic dividend, which is something that we saw, say, 20 years ago in China. So that's something that's going to propel growth going forward. That in turn is propelling investment. And it's really focused on two areas. The first is more focused on, shall we say, food security and securing supply. And so we've seen investments from companies throughout ASEAN into Australia and New Zealand, and in different subsectors, but beef being one of the key ones. And so whether that is Gunung Sewu's acquisition of Willaroo Station or Japfa's acquisition of Riverine and Inverway stations, that is all about Indonesia, for example, securing supply of beef. And there are many other examples as well. Then you've got more aspirational consumption in food. And here we've seen a couple of examples from the Philippines. You've got Universal Robina Corporation's acquisition of Griffins in New Zealand and Consolidated Sacks in Australia. And that's really about aspirational consumption. It's about securing leading brands in Australia and New Zealand for the domestic markets, but also bringing those brands into Asia. And for that, another example of that would be First Pacific and Wilmar's acquisition of Goodman Fielder. So we're seeing actually quite a bit of interest in inbound investment, and we would expect that inbound investment piece in Australia and New Zealand to continue over the coming years.
And such a great story.
Yeah.
And of course it wouldn't be a conversation in ASEAN markets without covering that hotly discussed topic of the price of milk.
Yes.
Can you give us a bit of an update on the dairy industry more broadly?
Sure. It's one of the industries that is growing quickly and that will continue to grow quickly. You take China as a case in point. The milk consumption in China is probably growing about 7 to 8% year on year, which from the current base is just massive. And we're seeing similar growth rates across ASEAN. Now, what is interesting is when you look at the price of milk, and in particular the price of imported milk across Asia. Again, using Greater China as an example, milk retails for between 5 to 6 Australian dollars per litre. Now, when you reflect upon the price of milk in Australia, where private label milk sells for $1 a litre, and where farmers generally get between 45 and 50 cents at the moment for a litre of milk, there's clearly a lot to be gained in downstream, if you like. And our research or our analysis tells us that about 75% of the profit pool for milk exported from Australia into Asia is actually earned downstream. So therein lies the opportunity, I think, clearly for Asian importers and for ASEAN importers, but also for Australian exporters and New Zealand exporters. So it really begs the question, how can Australian and New Zealand dairy companies, for example, move downstream to capture a bigger slice of that profit pool?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question, not just for dairy, but across Australia and New Zealand agri more broadly.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Great.